there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to make these country Christmas cards using some stamps from our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. These are fun to make, and by the time you're done making them, you will have a whole batch of cards. Here you can see the stamps I'm going to be using, and you can find them at pegstamps.com. They are so versatile, and honestly, if you have any small stamps, you can use them for this project, but these are the specific ones that I'm using, and I will link them below in the video description. So the premise of this card is that you are going to trace a stencil. You could use a clip art of a Christmas tree online if you don't have a stencil. I've had this for years, and if you've been crafting for any amount of time, you probably have some just plain old Christmas tree stencils. Now here I'm tracing it with a pencil, but I recommend using a pen because I had to trace them over later when I went to cut them out because I couldn't see my lines. So my big change for this, I would just be like, go ahead and use a Sharpie for this. It'll be fine. I was able to get 5 Christmas trees on this piece of 8.5 by 11 inch smooth white cardstock. So that will give me 5 different patterns of paper. So what you want to do is use a Post-it note or some masking tape. Just make sure it's really low tack. This is Post-it tape, so it's not going to peel up my paper. If you only have regular masking tape, make sure you stick it to your sweater a few times to take some of that sticky off. Basically, you just want to protect the area around it. And we're going to use blending brushes to add a kind of a hint of color all over the tree, and we're going to do some tone on tone stamping. And by the way, I just found out yesterday that the blending brushes are back in stock at Rubber Stamp Tapestry. They get sold, they sell out like every time they get them back in stock. So if you've been waiting for them, go ahead and grab them now. So pretty much for every one of these trees, I'm going to do some tone on tone stamping, which means I brush on the color and then I'll stamp on some small patterns in that same color. And I did a sprig of holly leaves, I did a cluster of 2 holly leaves, and I did use berries and gave them just used a hint of red, just because I think that looks really Christmassy. And then the other ones I just did a single color. So after you're done one, you'll want to, you can reuse that same tape. You're going to mask off another tree. I tried to go not to the tree that's right next to it, because if that ink is still wet, it's going to get on the bottom of the tape, and then when I move the tape again, I'll transfer it. So I just make sure that I don't go right next to one I just stamped. So for the poinsettia, I dusted it in red and then stamped in red and then filled in with some tiny poinsettias. So that's a nice thing about having a variety of different stamp sets, is because you can mix and match them. I grabbed a bunch of different stamp sets, but then I was even using stamps from different sets together to create my little fabric. What I'm going for is kind of that quilted calico look. I used to love these books when I was a kid in the 80s, and they were called Christmas is Coming, and I think they were made by Better Homes and Gardens. I'm not 100% sure, but my mother used to get these books in the mail, and they would have all these little craft projects, and a lot of them were fabric crafts. And like there would be, you know, tree skirts that you could sew, or stockings, like Christmas stockings you could sew. And I just loved that kind of pieced fabric, like I guess calico fabric, quilted calico fabric projects. It just reminds me of being a kid in the 80s and those projects that were really popular. So I'm sure this might look really dated to some of you, but I just think it, I don't know, harkens back to a simpler time. And then for the last pattern, I just dusted it with blue and did a bunch of different snowflakes from a couple of the Peg Stamp sets. And then what you want to do is trim out every tree. Now, like I mentioned, I did have to go and trace over my trees because I couldn't see my lines very well. So that's why I recommend just drawing them in pen. We're going to be inking the edges later anyway, so it won't hurt that there's a dark edge. Also, I wanted to mention, if you had a die cut of a Christmas tree, you could totally use that and save yourself a little bit of time. You might even be able to cut them out all at once. And then you wouldn't even have to draw the Christmas tree. You could just do, you know, rectangles of pattern. So whatever you have for supplies, you can make it work, even if it's just printing out a Christmas tree online. So then when you're done cutting them out, stack them up, and then you're going to cut them apart. Now, since I had 5 patterns, it would have made sense to cut them into 5 pieces, but I wasn't really thinking very straight when I was doing this, and I cut it into 6 pieces, but it's not a big deal. You'll see how we make sure that we don't get the same colors next to each other. So what I did here was I would just kind of put my tree together, and I just made sure I had a different piece on top so that when I went to glue them down, I could just grab the tree on the top of the pile and I could put it together. I started by assembling my tree on a piece of cardstock first, just to make sure I didn't get turned around when I went to make my cards. Once you have glue down, you stick a piece of paper down, you don't want to have to rip it back up. So once I determined how all these pieces go together, it's oddly confusing once you cut it apart, which is kind of crazy. You think it looks so simple. I went ahead and I traced my Christmas tree on my cardstock, and I actually traced, since this one has like a really thick line, I made sure to trace on the inside of the line on this, where when I cut the tree, when I drew the trees on the white paper, I drew it on the outside line so that I would have, a bigger tree. So I knew that I could put my adhesive down, but my lines wouldn't show. And then I simply just stuck each piece down within the tree shape that I drew. It's really hard to see that tree shape on the video, but it's there and I can see it where I'm working. I'm inking the edges of each piece before I put it down because it gives it a little bit of dimension. I'm not going to be, adding anything to puff up these pieces, so that's just going to help with the believability of it being like a fabric, like a quilted fabric thing. And it just gives it a little bit more of a finished look. That few seconds of inking the edges really is worth it. And then what I'm doing is using a black permanent pen. This is just a Sharpie, and I like to use a cheap pen for this because when you're drawing these little stitching lines between the pieces of fabric, if you have like a gap, sometimes the nib will kind of fall down the hole, and I think it might be a little bit rough on like a really fine tip micron or a finer pen. So I'm not too worried about a Sharpie because they cost less than $1 and they're pretty resilient to this sort of thing. And then I traced the entire tree. So this is why I'm saying that it would have been fine if you just traced the stencil with a pen to begin with. And then I'm just going to go around the entire tree and do this zigzag stitch. Now, of course, you could do a different stitch if you want. You could do just like a regular straight stitch. You could do a blanket stitch, completely up to you and whatever you prefer. Try not to make it perfect. I think it looks even more homespun if the stitches are a little bit wobbly. And then I have a cream card base here that is just a half a sheet of cardstock folded in half, and I'm going to adhere this onto that card base. If you get any ink smudges on the background, you can always stamp some snowflakes in brown, or snowflakes work good because they can go anywhere. It just can cover up a smudge so you can use the card. And Christmas cards, you need so many Christmas cards, so it's nice to not have to toss one away because you got an ink smudge. You could totally make it work. And I think that is a totally cute little idea just as is. But I wanted to embellish, and I looked around and I didn't really have any small Christmas embellishments, but I found these hearts and dots that I got at the stamp show this year on clearance. And even though the colors aren't really Christmassy, I thought they worked really well because they kind of had that old country look, because they're kind of like dusty pink and dusty orange, and I really thought it looked nice. I hope you give this project a try. You could obviously do it with other shapes as well, and there you can see some snowflakes in the background where I got some ink smudges, and I hope you enjoy this project. I thought it was a lot of fun to make, and it reminds me of Christmases as a kid. Please check out our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. You can find them at pegstamps.com to find the supplies I used today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy crafting!